19-year-old Matilda Scheurer was dying. Green fluid dripped from her mouth. Her fingernails had turned emerald. Even the whites of her eyes were beginning to change. She wasn't sick and hadn't been attacked. So, what was killing her? To answer that question, we have to open a newspaper.
In the 1860s, British newspapers accomplished something that, at first glance, seems almost impossible. They managed to report the consequences of a deadly product while enthusiastically helping to sell that very same product, often within the same edition. On one page, readers could find reports about young factory workers suffering from mysterious illnesses, their bodies failing after months of handling a fashionable green pigment. Turn a few pages, and they would be greeted by elegant illustrations of smiling women in brilliant emerald gowns, accompanied by advertisements describing the color as the latest symbol of refinement and good taste. The deaths were real, the advertisements were real, and somehow both comfortably coexisted in the same newspaper. That wasn't simply an editorial contradiction, it was a business model. Like most newspapers of the 19th century, the British press depended heavily on advertising revenue. Department stores, textile merchants, dressmakers, and luxury boutiques weren't just customers of the press, they helped finance it. Fashion sold newspapers, and newspapers sold fashion. So when concerns about a fashionable new pigment began reaching doctors and coroners, publishers found themselves in an awkward position. Reporting the story was journalism. Questioning the advertisers who paid the bills was something else entirely. Instead, the danger was quietly pushed into the background. Deaths became small columns buried deep inside the paper. Fashion remained front-page material. And that's exactly where Matilda Scheurer enters the story. She wasn't an aristocrat attending glamorous balls in London, nor was she one of the wealthy women proudly wearing the latest Paris fashions. She worked at the opposite end of the industry, in a factory where artificial flowers were dyed the brilliant shade of green that Victorian society had suddenly become obsessed with. Day after day, she handled the pigment with her bare hands. She breathed it in, brushed it from her clothes, and carried it home on her skin. Nobody warned her that the same vivid color admired in fashionable shop windows was also one of the most toxic substances used by Victorian manufacturers. By the time doctors examined her in 1861, the poisoning had become impossible to ignore. Contemporary reports described green staining on her body, relentless vomiting, and severe organ failure caused by prolonged exposure to arsenic. She died at just 19 years old. Her death made headlines, but not the kind you might expect, because while newspapers acknowledged what had happened to Matilda, they rarely questioned the obsession that had put her in that factory in the first place. Instead, the emerald craze continued almost uninterrupted, driven by fashion houses, retailers, and the same newspapers that continued telling readers this dazzling new color represented elegance, sophistication, and modern taste. And to understand why an entire society became so captivated by a color that was quietly poisoning the people who made it, we have to go back almost a century, to the moment chemistry accidentally created the most desirable shade of green Europe had ever seen. Nobody seemed particularly interested in asking an obvious question. What exactly made this green so different? The answer was hiding in plain sight. The extraordinary brilliance of Sheila's green came from one ingredient that manufacturers considered almost insignificant: arsenic. Not a trace amount, not an accidental contaminant. Arsenic was an essential part of the pigment itself. Today, that sounds almost unbelievable. The idea of deliberately incorporating one of history's most notorious poisons into consumer products would destroy a company overnight. But 19th century chemistry operated under very different assumptions. Arsenic wasn't viewed exclusively as a poison. It appeared in pesticides, medicines, cosmetics, pigments, and countless industrial processes. People understood that swallowing large quantities could be fatal, but far fewer understood what happened when tiny particles entered the body day after day, year after year. And that misunderstanding turned out to be extraordinarily profitable. Manufacturers saw a revolutionary color. Fashion houses saw a guaranteed bestseller.
Direct from Paris, ladies.
It is truly mesmerizing.
Retailers saw eager customers. Newspapers saw advertisers. Very few people saw a public health disaster waiting to unfold. At first, the victims were easy to ignore. Factory workers complained about persistent coughs that never seemed to disappear. Their hands developed painful sores. Their skin became irritated. Their hair began falling out. And many suffered constant nausea. Employers blamed poor hygiene, weak constitutions, or bad working conditions, anything except the pigment itself. After all, the customers weren't getting sick, or at least, that's what everyone believed. The assumption seemed perfectly logical. The people making the dresses were surrounded by the pigment all day long. Of course they became ill. But the women buying those dresses? They only wore them for a few hours at a time. Surely they were safe. The newspapers certainly thought so.
The problem was, arsenic didn't care whether you made the dress or simply wore it. At first, the explanation seemed perfectly reasonable. The people getting sick were factory workers. They spent long hours surrounded by green dust, handling the pigment with their bare hands. If anyone was going to suffer, surely it would be them. The customers simply wore the finished dresses. What danger could there possibly be in that? As it turned out, quite a lot. Arsenic didn't stay trapped inside the fabric. Every step, every dance, every movement released tiny particles into the air. Invisible to the eye, but easy to breathe. Doctors soon noticed something disturbing. Wealthy women, women who had never worked in a dye factory, were arriving with the same mysterious symptoms: persistent skin problems, chronic coughing, hair loss, and, in the worst cases, organ failure. They had only one thing in common. They all adored the latest emerald fashion. One of the strongest warnings came from the renowned chemist August Wilhelm Hofmann. He argued that a woman entering a crowded ballroom in a heavily dyed green dress could release enough arsenic into the air to affect everyone around her. The evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. The newspapers, however, found an elegant solution. The warnings were printed. So were the advertisements. A small article discussing arsenic poisoning could appear just a few pages away from a full-page promotion for the season's newest emerald gowns. The facts were there. They simply weren't the story. And while doctors were trying to convince the public that something was terribly wrong, the fashion industry kept selling the color that had already claimed lives, including Matilda's. Unfortunately, arsenic was only the beginning. Victorian fashion still had far deadlier ideas to come. If you enjoy uncovering the strange, forgotten, and sometimes disturbing stories buried in old newspapers, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next file.